Hello, and welcome to Medieval Lulls, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Irina Dumitrescu, and I teach medieval literature at the University of Bonn.
And I'm Mary Wellesley, and I'm an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Historical Research in London.
We are both writers, literary historians, and contributors to the paper. In this series, we are asking, was the Middle Ages funny? We're taking a tour through texts both familiar and unfamiliar, in English, Latin, and other European vernacular languages, and hunting for laughter and jest in the textual remains of the past. In the final episode of our series, we encounter a wickedly witty Welsh poet, one of the most memorable women authors of the Middle Ages, the poet of the pussy, the bard of the beaver, the minstrel of the muff. I'm speaking, of course, of Gwerful Mechain. So, Mary, can you tell us a little bit about Gwerful Mechain? Who was she? When did she live?
Well, we know, unfortunately, precious little about her biography. We know that she lived around 1460 to 1502, so the very end of the 15th century, the kind of tail end of the medieval period. She was from Powys, from an area of Powys in kind of northeast Wales, sort of close to the border with England. She was married to a man called John ap Llywelyn Mechain, and we know of at least one child, a daughter named Maud. I think the most important thing to say is that she was clearly part of this very lively literary coterie of male poets and was obviously exchanging verse with them. And this was a kind of active coterie. She was not perhaps a sort of figure working alone, writing stuff perhaps for herself. It was very public. It was very combative. It was social. It was kind of conversational. And I think that's the sort of key thing for us to understand about her as a poet.
Well, and it's also quite a complex poetic tradition, right? So the poet typically, to be a Welsh bard, required a professional training. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about why this took 7 years to learn how to write medieval Welsh poetry. But it's too complex for us to go into great detail here, but just give us a flavor of what this poetry was like. And it's quite different from medieval English poetry, for example, or even French.
Yeah, I want to preface this by saying I am not a Welsh speaker, so I've read quite a lot about this, but fundamentally I think there are bits of it that I'll just never really understand because I don't speak Welsh. But there is this metrical form called Synghanedd, which is literally translates as harmony, and it's what they call strict meter poetry. And what's incredible about strict meter poetry is it's something that is alive today. It's a tradition that is still being used by poets in contemporary Wales, and that's kind of an incredible thing. If we look back at English poetry of the Middle Ages, many of particularly obviously Old English, where you have internal rhyme but no end rhyme, and you have these kind of half lines, that poetic tradition has died out. But what's amazing about Welsh is that it continues to this day. It's still being used, and it's still fiendishly complicated. So there are 24 different forms of meter in the tradition, and each verse line is broken down into 2 half lines, which is actually much like Old English poetry. But the Welsh tradition makes the half lines and the patterning within the half lines even more complex than Old English, where you don't have end rhyme, you just have internal rhyme, because the sequence of consonants in one half line follows the order in the other one. And you have both internal rhyme and end rhyme. So it's really just mind-bogglingly complex. It has very clear advantages for oral performance because it's a really great mnemonic device. So if you can't remember the second half of a particular line, all you have to do is fit the words needed into the pattern of the first half. This kind of strict meter verse was very much patronised and performed for and by Welsh nobles and gentry. So it was a kind of elite literary form. And the bardic tradition was a professionalised one, from which, crucially, women and low-born men were excluded. And so that's why it's particularly interesting that Gwerfel took this complex literary form and kind of made it her own, as we'll see.
And these lines can occur in poems of different lengths, right? That you can see them in quite short poetry, like the Englyn, or quite long poetic forms, and we get both of those in her work.
Exactly. So there's the Cwyth, which is between 40 and 80 lines, and it's made of a seven-syllable rhyming couplets. And then there's this the Englyn, which is much shorter. It's 4 lines, but it's very kind of highly structured, really beautifully wrought. It's really a form in which not a word can be wasted, and it can often be used in Gwerfyl's work, sometimes sort of suggesting transience. There's such incredible economy to it. But then we also see her working with these much longer poems, much more expansive narrative poems. So she was a poet of extraordinary technical skill.
I think that's important to say, because our listeners will be shocked at this point to find out that some of her work is a little bit obscene, or at least on topics one might not think of relating to medieval poetry, unless, of course, one had spent a lot of time reading medieval poetry. But the point is that this is, even when she's describing bodily functions, and in some cases, in one case, quite a coarse bodily function, she's always doing it in this highly structured poetic style. And that's part of the poetic achievement and the wit, is that it's all coming in this technically refined poetic form.
Yes, and some scholars have said that the way in which she used the strict meter form wasn't always completely correct, and that sometimes she kind of made mistakes, and that was by dint of the fact that she was a woman and she hadn't had this kind of professional training in the way that other contemporary poets had. But I think, sometimes there's one way to see her work as perhaps, not quite following the rules, but you could also see that as her being kind of inventive with the form.
And there's maybe one more poetic technique to name here, which is the divalu, and I will also admit that I do not speak Welsh modern or medieval, but this is a poetic technique where a poet describes something in many different ways, and part of the pleasure of the poem is the inventiveness involved in a kind of catalog of descriptive language. And we're going to see that in today's episode as well, quite brilliantly done by Gwerful. So maybe that's a good transition to ask, Mary, could you introduce us to Gwerful Mechain's best known poem? Why are we spending time with her today?
So this is a poem called Cywydd y Cedor, which is translated as something like Poem of the Cunt. Also sometimes in the manuscripts called Cywydd y Cedor, which perhaps you might translate as something like Poem of the Vagina, or Ode to the Vagina. It is an absolutely wonderful, riotous poem about female genitalia. You would expect nothing less, listeners. But it's a really, really interesting work that is playful and feminist and funny.
Maybe we could take a step back for a moment. Probably won't surprise our listeners to hear that medieval Welsh had its fair share of licentious poems. What kind of... Gwerful is not the first, right? She's not the first to come up with a poem like this. What does she seem to be responding to? What kind of poem does she seem to have in mind when she writes her ode to the vagina or to the cunt? Cywydd y Cedor.
So there's a poem by Dafydd ap Gwilym, which is called Poem to the Penis. And we should add that all of our translations today are by Katie Gramich. It presents the penis as this kind of unruly, naughty thing that has to be guarded. And it describes it as the vilest of rolling pins, but also as a gift for the ladies of Christendom. It is pretty explicit. It describes the central pillar of the two halves of a girl, a long night's pillage, 100 nights chisel, purgatory to a small cunt. And we get the sense of the penis as something that that is deceitful, that does evil, that is troublesome. Very interestingly, in some manuscripts, this poem is attributed to Gwerful. But I think what's interesting is that she clearly is responding to this particular poem, and she's taking this extremely kind of hyper-masculine poem and writing a new and kind of fascinating version of it.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Medieval Lols, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. You can listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series by signing up to our close reading subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.